Okay, welcome everyone. So we're going to be discussing decolonizing sociology. I want to thank Sayeda for taking the initiative to organize this panel. And I want to thank all of our speakers who made time for this in their very busy schedules. And without further ado, I'll let Sayeda introduce our guests and start the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Sherzad. So I started talking to Laura about this discussion of decolonizing peace and war studies because as somebody who has been working on the war in Afghanistan and reading material on peace and sociology of peace and war, I was really struck by how much there's a need for this sort of discussion. So that's how Laura and I started thinking about having a panel on it. And I do believe that we are very lucky to have excellent presenters and scholars who are here to talk about it. And so without further ado, I would invite the scholars to talk about the topic of the need for decolonizing sociology of peace and war, and also a little bit about how we can do it. And so I would first ask Professor James Fenelon to give his talk about his ideas. Professor Fenelon is a professor of sociology and director of Indigenous People Studies at California State University. He teaches on urban inequality, race and racism, of course, Indigenous studies, and social movements. Professor Fenelon.
So hello, as I'm trying to share screen here, as an Indigenous person and some of the values that I would bring, I would begin a talk like this by introducing myself, which is the first decolonial act, which is traditionally done in our communities. So let me start off this slide presentation, and we'll see which. I have two screens, so we'll see which one you end up with. Should I switch screens or?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So I would first introduce myself, and so Mitawakan Tunka Gideshka Sapa, and I would identify myself and my nations and peoples, Dakota, Mitawakan Dakota, and also Lakota, but I also recognize my other origin points, Gaelic, Irish, and Scandinavian with a French name. And we use the indigenous language, Tayawaki, Ian, Poshtata, Okashpe. So my father is from the place where the rock or the stone stands upright that you would know as Standing Rock. And therefore I can say I'm from that place. And then I also acknowledge myself, as with him, as a veteran both of the armed forces, but also movement groups, you know, against other people and in other nations, but primarily identify as a citoyen du monde, a global commitment. Increasingly, we're seeing land acknowledgements, in this case, a land and water acknowledgement that try and do similar things. So they're often criticized as being perfunctory and or symbolic, which can be the case, but what we want to do in a decolonial way is to actionate them, right? To make them connected with recommendations that would cause both the agency, the institution, or the people to begin to act in a decolonial ways, which institutions resist, by the way. My work now looks at a 500-year analysis, which every way along the way can be interpreted as a re-envisioning of what happened in the colonizing of the Americas. And so what we did, we started in Haiti, where I used to live and work for a while. And there they have great stories of Anna Kaona, among other people. She was a great woman leader of Charagua, one of the 5 nations there. So we commissioned this picture of her, and this is how the book is going to start on out. And she actually stands up and negotiates with the incoming Spanish people. And they're especially worried when they run into strong women that are very fair with their people. So they end up giving her a brutal execution, even though she was probably one of the most beautiful people you could imagine. And so in this sense, what this is evidence of is that the even initial colonialisms are very violent processes that are racializing, large numbers of people, all the way to millions in many nations, right? And it's connected with ideologies arising from the West, such as the church, and it's racializing people, first indigenous people as Indians, and then very often African descent people brought to be slaves as Blacks. And so this is a discourse now well known with Columbus, and we can argue those numbers. I often get into that. The processes that they're using, the encomienda process, and so on. And then, importantly, the destruction of great empires and cities, such as at Tenochtitlan, which are easily the equivalent of everything or anything coming out of Europe, which also becomes a kind of decolonial act. A number of series of policies where they're trying to deal with the human rights preceding the English colonial system that most of us look at. So you actually have the 1512 laws of Burgos are clearly struggling with what rights do Indians have? That's coming from the Dominicans as well as other splinter groups, of the Catholic Church. And then the new laws of 1542, and then what I think one of the grandest debates in the world, the debates at Valladolid in 1550, that both sides say they won, but really didn't change the practices. But it's important to see it because all of the ideologies and human rights arguments were in place there. And so sometimes we look a little bit more at what the Spaniards were doing. But then we get into the rise of England and the other European countries, and their premier issue is that they begin to form companies. These are actually joint stock-held companies. So they're the precursor to capitalism, to corporate capitalism. And there's a continuation with there. And they have almost as much to say with what's going on in the colonies as the colonizer and the state structure themselves, because it's about seizing wealth and distributing it to various European powers. So here's a list of the companies, at least the early ones. So I'm not certain that this exists anywhere, so I put it together, right? And some of the privateers were actually mostly funded as joint stock companies, as companies, right? Which is amazing. But then when the banking and the other institutions out of the Netherlands come on up, the Dutch get into this and issue the first permanent joint stock company in the East India Company and take over the transatlantic slave trade. So people in world systems analysis will argue that they're hegemonic. I don't believe they are, but they're such earlier purveyors on it that they get this economic control. Think of this is the transfer of millions of people in the most brutal conditions possible in order to have an incredibly exploitable labor force of the native populations that are being wiped on out. Similarly, the Virginia Company of London, a well-known discourse, the Plymouth Company, and very importantly, the Royal African Company, which happens between the Reformation and the Enlightenment, because the English later on are acting like they're such liberators. And this was the first permanent joint stock company that took over both ends of the African transatlantic slave trade. And for about 3 or 4 decades becomes the premier trader in the world. So we're aware of this when we're decolonizing. We have to see this relationship, which you have, the triangular system. Some people call it the circuit trade, but it's a dual set of triangles because you're having the rise of the United States that becomes a premier player and even begins to do some of their own trading and enslaved peoples in order to build up these markets. So later on with cotton and so on, this is going to be the rise of industrial capitalism. These company investors lost hope of finding wealth in gold, which is probably the largest wealth transfer in the history of the world. So then begin to move to agricultural systems that vastly change the ecosphere and the environment, okay? While they're destroying native nations and they're beginning to bring in both indentured servitude and enslaved labor and turning everything into private property that they held and other people couldn't. That's gonna be the nature of citizenship. So I often start with the Lenape, Delaware. I have to go really fast because I already spent too much long here in Pennsylvania. They were the first people that they had a treaty with the United States. but they're often seen as Indians, even though they make this first treaty. So their history is removed. They even had a scalp act. There's maximized genocidal removal. And when I got on out here, I was a little bit surprised. There's a complete and utter erasure of them within the state government. There's just no representation in the entire state. So that'll be, I bring that up at the end, similar with the Wampanoag and the Pequot and Narragansett in the New England, the genocidal wars. So when we deconstruct some of these histories and the way they're being typified, we begin to see a dominant narrative as an important part of the colonial exercise. And that's what when we're decolonized, we have to try and identify what these processes are. And so, for instance, at one of the ASAs, we were saying the land was taken physically, politically, violently, philosophically by the founding fathers in starting the Declaration of Independence with the words that are in the Declaration, merciless Indian savages. So it's a kind of a dehumanization process. And so we identified the people that made the Scalp Act, the first governor, Morris, the person that put it in the Philadelphia Gazette, Benjamin Franklin, and then a young militia officer by George Washington. We also then look at, we'll skip over all this, a lot of people won some Pulitzer Prizes on it by realizing a lot of the early race laws are actually in New England when they're conquering native peoples and trading them for African people in the Caribbean. And then so when I get into Pennsylvania, we have a little bit with that. So two great racial constructs are emerging from which, or three, that they produce citizenship laws. The idea of Indians and Blacks, and I've tracked this down. Everybody says that, well, it's not in the Constitution, but it is in the census that the Constitution is built upon, right? So it's literally a racially constructed document that by the late 20th century, you have the rise of core economic powers, which are really the late stage colonial completed project that are literally changing environments that are corporate directed capital markets. So sometimes we get into the way this is imaged in various ways. And so what they've produced is a structural racism for land and labor exploitation based on the market needs of large transnational corporations that we can see rose in these companies. So when you move into the modern age with countries like the United States, what they can then do is develop these systems where they're exporting on a global level a lot of this inequality and injustice, which enriches their own nation, just like the Europeans did. And almost all of it is about who has access to private property, which in many ways they make almost sacred in the nature of civilization. And so we get into a little bit deeper when I have more to go on. This is the model. This is in our second work, Indigenous Peoples and Globalization. So you're actually seeing these peoples within communities, relationships to the land, and the leadership, as well as their economic patterns, redistribution, as actually being countering to capitalism and the expropriation devices out of colonialism. And then we're going to skip over a lot of this. We look at how they regulate these processes, now they come into conflict. So that they're constructed with violent exploitation and extermination that we now see are tendencies to self-destruction, because they're causing ever-ending war. You can go look at the Ukraine right now. No, the United Nations, nobody can stop that war because the different sides are war powers, and neither one can turn themselves off. The other one is climate change, which could clearly destroy much of our civilizations. We cannot turn the system on off because it's not driven by the political process. It's driven by the companies and the constructions. So we talk about this as being hegemonic relationships. Here's my works so far. And if we had more time, we'd look at how Haiti, Hispaniola is the perfect case study. It's probably one of the most beautiful places in the world, run by people like Ana Kahona at the beginning, and it becomes the poorest, most oppressed and dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere. And so as a product of a country that totally resisted. So this is my new work coming out at the end of April that looks at this as a long-term process. And then it asks these questions. We have to understand these if we're going to attempt decolonization within the system. So Chomsky calls these the twin towers of our own destruction. The very fate of the species are hanging on this, and yet we cannot address it, like neoliberalism in Chile and so on. Instead, we call these societies primitive and so on. So there you see the actual model. If we're doing revitalization, if we had more time, that's in our second book. Various groups have emerged. This is Zapatistas that actually challenge those models and develop new ways of community and so on. And they're challenging across the First Nations, tribal, indigenous survival. So we have this is Yavasia, up at the Zapotecas, and we have, this is in Ecuador, where they actually passed in their constitution. Some of the Pehuenche and Mapuche involved in the struggle in Chile. And so we look around and we find they all have these ideas of the broader environment world that works for the benefit of their people and the rights of relations to other life forms in the environment itself. A completely different model than an extractive dominating capitalist system, which colonialism is really built on. And so even Bolivia has the laws of Mother Earth. And I want to get this of Pachamama that they use as an example of that. So there's ideologies, icons that are in resistance as well as domination. So to get to this, we'll skip over this. And I'm going to take you to the 6 or 8 points. This is when we're actually meeting with these Zapatista leaders. So they have the same, that's a medicine wheel, but this is their ancient model and version of the world. These are the words they use. And then among my own people, we actually look at a spiritual way that was made illegal by the United States. It's called the Sundance. It's really in the Indian Offenses Act. And it's not resolved till 1978 because it's seen as a threat to this system. And these are the words we use. So I want to bring up, my good friend, these 6 systems, and then quickly state what it is that they're doing. There's a centralization, therefore, of power and economics, a centralization of authority and power. I also want to do each answer, but I have to try and finish. Well, I will do that. The bottom part is, so the indigenous peoples, especially in Bolivia, they've made it part of the constitution, have developed a concept called plurinationality. You can find it in the Haudenosaunee Confederation. You can find it in the ancient Oceti-Sakowin among the Dakota and Lakota peoples. That's where many nations come together, and no nation can say no to the other nations, unlike the United Nations. So the second major concept is commodification and capitalization. So we counter that or decolonize it by valuing the living environment. So we have words as relatives for land, trees, animal, physical life. Stone, like I said, my father, Ate, and Ian Poshdato Kashpi. So that's literally a relationship that we take care of. The third one is a social, political, and law enforcement of a dominant systems and whose citizens. So instead, all communities have consuls, that's Anaka Ona, the head of those consuls, that have restorative justice. The fourth one is major transportation and power production systems based on fossil fuels, right? So instead have a locality for food and distributing networks. And then at the heart of the matter, which is what we're all dealing with, a philosophy and canon that's based on human power and stratification systems within there. So instead, what we have is, especially among the Dakota, a philosophy of relatives. There's a responsibility to all one's relatives. And then the last one, exploitation and monetary power over the earth as resources, which capitalism and colonialism exploit. Instead, we have a spirituality of the land, right? And then sacred ties and ancestry origin to that. And then this is up at Standing Rock when they were going up to North Dakota against the Capitol. So we go look at, most of our women lead a lot of this, and that's with you've heard the 7th generation, but the generation to the generation to the generation, which would counter both of the main systems of self-destruction. So the last couple of slides is how this just happened in this last week out here in Pennsylvania. Some of the removed peoples I referred to, the Lenape, Delaware, can now refers to diasporic people. So they're removed in wars and treaties all the way out to Oklahoma, they become out of Indian country. So they're now coming back to Pennsylvania and they're saying, this is our ancestral land and you need to recognize that in Truth and Reconciliation Commissions. And so out here, we're sponsoring them. This is just right outside our college halls here. They have a woman leader. She's been twice reelected. And then this is their main representative talk. This is the tribal historic preservation officer. This is happening among historic indigenous peoples everywhere we go. And so we're meeting, with our provost, who, by the way, is going to become the president of Smith College. So it's really powerful. Yes, I'm ending it right now. The next one is the last slide. So what this is a full-scale operation where we come back, and it's the ultimate decolonial act to talk about all of this history and to try and restore indigenous systems. So in our ways, what we were just doing with the ghost dance church and remembering our ancestors is we call on the spirits to lift the silenced voices that come out of these systems to end genocide and domination. And that is my presentation. So we end with the words, Omitaku o Yasin, we are all relatives, let us treat each other with respect.
Thank you, Jim. I would like to introduce Yujun Kun now. She's assistant professor of sociology and comparative race and ethnicity studies at Reed College. Yujun's coming book project is very relevant to our discussion today. It's about how anti-Asian racism and US militarism in Asia are somehow connected. So, Yujun.
Hi, good morning or afternoon, depending on where you are. Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me to be part of this coffee conversation. It is my very first one, so I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you all. I took this coffee hour a little bit more literally, so I'm going to speak a little bit more casually. And I thought that since I am at a liberal arts college and I work with undergraduates, that I would kind of tailor my comments more towards teaching. And so the first thing that I'll say is that both of my teaching and research, so like Sayeda said, I teach in sociology and the comparative race and ethnicity studies program. I'm the first and only official hire that has a formal obligation in that program, and that is our version of ethnic studies. And so because I am kind of situated in both of these programs, my teaching very much overlaps with ethnic studies and sociology. And so what this means for my undergraduates, for my students, is that they get to learn about the really, really complicated past of the discipline itself, and how it emerges from within a colonial context in the United States. So in my course on the sociology of race and racism, much of which was structured from my own graduate course that I took with Moonki Jang, who I see is also here. Hi, Moonki. But we begin with pairing Gossett's kind of like classic text on race, the history of an idea. And then I pair that with Julian Go's 2013 work that is titled, oh, there we go. Let me see here. Where is that title? There we go. Sociology's Imperial Unconscious, the emergence of American sociology in the context of empire. So sociology students often enter thinking that sociology is like the kind of left wing progressive discipline and major, where it's like all about social change and justice. And then they take this class and realize the field is founded on eugenics and active engagement with colonialism, and then the production and circulation of racist colonial logics and knowledges. And so that is really the starting point for how I engage in this process of decolonizing knowledge that is by necessity requires us to talk about the construction and use of race and colonialism as a practice simultaneously. And so that's kind of where I start my class. And then we move through more US-based paradigms and research on race. And so it really is, I think, one of the first tasks for me in a small liberal arts college where there aren't a whole lot of us, being on hiring committees, it's like you explicitly don't hire somebody who does the same thing as you. So there's only one of us. Is that I want them to understand how race and colonialism and these very kind of common sense understandings and things that they assume they know, right, is actually rooted in this really violent history that has manifested and embedded itself in our institutions and the way that we know and how we know. And so we go through that. We also, one of my favorite weeks in my graduate education was actually talking about internal colonialism, because that was like a new idea for me at the time, and the students also really enjoy it. And then I pair that with Jody Bird's Transit of Empire, Indigenous Critiques of Colonialism, and some Latin scholars as well in their critiques of the internal colonialism paradigm. And then I kind of round out this semester bringing it back to empire by pairing Evelyn Nakano-Glunn's settler colonialism as structure. So this is familiar because throughout the semester, they also read Bonilla Silva's work. And then also Katrina Kissimmee-King, hi Katrina, work on recentering US empire, a structural perspective of the color line, just to kind of like bring back the conversation, right? It's a class called Sociology of Race and Racism, but I bookend it and then include threads of critiques of the state, right, throughout the semester. And then I bookend it with this conversation on colonialism, race, and settler colonialism in the United States. And then their final project is a work that I think really helps students think about what the sociology of race really involves. And that involves a shift in our understanding of how we think about where we live, from shifting from a nation state paradigm to an empire state paradigm. And for some students, this is a little bit of a challenge in that it is what do we do with this, right? Yes, we can say that the US is an empire, or that the US does all of these imperial activities and practices overseas and also domestically. But then what does that mean for our agency of how we think about social change? It feels like a really heavy task to decolonize as if it is some end goal. And so that's, oftentimes the frustration. And I have them read Moonke's book, Beneath the Surface of White Supremacy, because I think it does a nice job kind of theoretically merging both the sociology of race and the sociology of empire literatures, and also the methodological piece as well. And so I have them read that, and they struggle through it. And they also really appreciate it. Because it does do a lot of that kind of bringing in all of these different fields together and having a more kind of cohesive conversation about race, about structure, about agency. And so that's one of the ways in which I think about teaching as a part of the decolonizing process, and kind of continuing on settler colonialism is an ongoing process that is a never-ending project. Decolonization is also never-ending, and I think back to this moment. I have a 6-year-old, and at that time they were 4, I believe, and we were talking about, it was Thanksgiving. We were talking about what that means. And I think when they were about 3 or so, I had introduced the concept of settler colonialism. And it is like the most fun experiment to have a young child. And I was like, do you remember that word, settler colonialism? They're like, maybe. I'm like, what do you think it means? Like, what does that mean? And they thought about it for a second, and they said, oh, right. That's when people come into your home and take over your world. And I thought that was, and I had actually never used that kind of concept of world taking over your world and coming into your home and taking over your world. But for some reason, that's a concept that stuck with them. And I think that, from a 4-year-old's brain, there's no filter. They tell it as it is. And for me, that really kind of encapsulates when they take over your home and take over your world, right? At some point, our world and their worlds merge. And it becomes really difficult to disentangle, right? And where is the end of colonialism? And so I think when we talk about decolonizing a discipline or decolonizing a field, I wonder if that is the most productive word to use. It has become this catch-all word. and this gigantic project and so maybe in terms of the work that we do, not just as teachers, but as researchers, to really be more specific about what we mean by decolonizing. Are we identifying, are we doing the work of seeing, like James was saying, right? Then yes, let's be specific about what our objective is. And then what are the mechanisms, right, that produce those silences and make things invisible? What is the mechanism? What are the mechanisms that do the erasing, right? If it's a project of identification. And so, if we maybe make it a little bit more specific, like I tell my students, specify, what do you mean by this, right? Then we can kind of have a more, I don't want to use the word pragmatic, but it feels a little bit more manageable because this is a long game. There is no kind of one action that will end this whole project. And so to think about how we can do this work that is sustainable, that is enriching, right? And that we do also need to sustain ourselves in the work that we do, because that impacts the way that our students also think about the work that they have to do ahead of them, whether that is in academia or in nonprofits or whatnot. And then 3, the last point I'll make is that the sociology of war and peace is actually, I was actually surprised to be invited to this, in that it's a section that I don't really engage with, although my work is very directly related to war, and I teach on war and violence. I teach a course this semester called Race, Power, Violence. So it is kind of my scholarly life. And I think and I was thinking about why this is, and I think it is because I do think about my home discipline as being rooted in ethnic studies and Asian American studies. And I was thinking about that for a minute and realizing that Asian American studies and ethnic studies is really founded on a study, right, and a critique of colonialism. And I wonder if sociology, right, and whether it's this specific section or more broadly, that we can be a little bit more porous in thinking about what we deem as legitimate evidence, how we think about data, and maybe that will help us see some of those erasures and hear some of those silences that the discipline has itself created. And so I'll take a pause there, and thank you, James, for your comments, and I'm really looking forward to reading your work. And I will pass that off to the next person.
Thank you, Eugene. Now I would invite Professor Fatma Muge-Gocek. She is a professor of sociology at University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. She writes and teaches about development, nationalism, and genocide, particularly in parts of the Middle East.
Thank you so much, and I apologize because what happened was that we had a power outage here, and I was caught in the middle, so I tried to go to the office, come back to the home again. I mean, it was crazy to see when it was going to come back, and thank goodness it came back. We had a lot of wind here for some reason. We had ice storm before that. I mean, nature is done haywire here, and that's why I couldn't connect before. So I truly apologize for what goes on. But this is wonderful conversation, and I think there's so much continuity among all of us. I think what is very interesting is sort of, I look at things more at the meta level, probably because of Edward Said's Orientalism and such. I'm sort of interested in more sort of how non-Western contexts are there and what we can learn through the insights we get in non-Western contexts. In my case, the Ottoman Empire or modern Turkey or the modern Middle East. So these are all things, at least I bring in, and I try to see decolonization from the vantage point of my empirical, at least, specialty. which is, as I said, the Middle East. And what is, I think, very important in all of our work is that I argue that until the 20th century, what we saw much more was a focus on knowledge, formal knowledge, and looking at how that knowledge sort of structured life from top down. What I think we do start seeing in the 21st century is realizing that sort of image ideal that was built, at least through Western European modernity, was an ideal that didn't apply pretty much anywhere, including the West itself in some instances. And I'm very interested in seeing, how that was then, that culture became, those meanings became very much, interpreted differently in different contexts. So how does this translate to my work? I totally agree with Yejun in that what's important is this is a process, decolonization, and it is a process that I think, if we think about us as academics, includes service, teaching, and research. I mean, so it's a process where you immerse yourself in it because it impacts every aspect of your life. And every aspect, not only of your professional life, but also your personal life as well, if you think about feminist theory standpoint and such. So that is what makes it a very different endeavor. As also was said before by James and Yejun, what's also very important is that how does that translate into teaching? I do teach on violence. The way I do it, at least for the undergraduates, is that I have this course called Terrorism, Torture, and Violence. And I start with terrorism, Islamic State terrorism back up there. Then I look at torture in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, US torture. And then I bring it to campus to look at campus sexual assault. So that what I'm doing is sort of taking violence from the macro all the way to the micro. And I try to get them to see how differently they perceive, Islamic State terrorism, where they're, willing to totally sort of, accept the violence, don't talk about any exceptions to it and such. But as you come to campus sexual assault, suddenly you sort of see that, they're not willing as much to acknowledge the violence in that context. And that gives you a sense of, the pushback, the resistance to it that I talk about. And the way I do it in my graduate one is I'm just teaching a class on Du Boisian post-decolonial theories. And there, what I would like to also maybe contribute to the discussion is, in addition to post-coloniality, that is, of course, discussed by Barbara Go and others, there is also the Du Boisian approach, which I also find extremely useful in the sense that too, especially through the notion of double consciousness, is able to bring sort of a whole new approach to society, one that doesn't privilege knowledge, formal knowledge, and weaponize it basically to colonize society, but rather which looks at meaning production from the ground up, and which meanings are selected and weaponized and which meanings are silenced. So that is sort of the process I look at least with them, and try to see how we can also include the Du Boisian approach in this whole decolonizing process. And how does it impact my service? I mean, I'm very interested then in diversity. What does diversity mean? How can we diversify academia? And we have these, things that they've sort of said in our reports, in our annual reports, we have to say, well, how do you contribute to diversity? And then they give examples. They say, well, if you go to a talk on diversity, if you sort of read something on diversity, and I'm thinking, this is also formally defining it. This does not tell you how we're going to be diversifying it. It doesn't capture the totality of the project, and it sort of reduces it down to certain actions again, like we did in the past. So that's why what we need to change, I argue. And how does that impact my research? I mean, and this goes back to, I also am not a member of peace, war, and conflict, even though I work on genocide. I mean, you know, genocide denial, especially. Why, again, I think sort of war, conflict, and peace is sort of, is a way, it's sort of a 20th century way of defining, I think, violence, more in the case of formal knowledge of what comprises a war and what doesn't. But then if you look at the 21st century, now we have war on terror. We have terrorism. I mean, we don't have as many conventional wars any longer because nobody can afford to take the United States on. But then we go into these proxy wars, we don't even call wars. I mean, you know, and I, of course, also taught a course on Iraq. I taught Introduction to Sociology through American and Iraqi societies because we live in one and die in the other one, I said. So that sort of gives you a sense. And how does that impact my own work? I also, of course, because I'm from the Middle East, but I have lived in America now for more than 40 years, I try to now look at the denial of violence. I looked about the denial of the Armenian genocide by Turkish state and society, and I get the insights I have there to see the violence against the Kurds in that context. And then from what I do is the theoretical insights I have from them, I bring to the United States, to the foundational violence against Native Americans and African Americans, to see the sort of genocides against them and how that was put. I think what's important is the boundaries of peace, war, conflict have to be defined in a way that not only sort of privileges conflicts that emerge from Western European modernity, but also look at what happens in the rest of the world that are either impacted, that mimic, as Homi Baba would say, what's going on, or have totally dynamics of their own, which are overlooked. So those are the kinds of things that I engage in. I hope that's good enough, or, you know, I don't know if I spoke too much or too little, but maybe I should stop there and see.
Thank you. I mean, you do have some more time, but let's open the floor for conversation. Thank you, the three of you, for your time and for your thoughts. I think we have a lot here for a rich discussion. So, and I see that David Schwartz already has a question. So I would ask you, David, to please ask your question.
Oh, hi. You can hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. So I've been in communication with some Native Americans from who are complaining to me that the current American system of giving a few tribes rights to gambling casinos leaves large numbers of other tribes in acute levels of poverty. This disturbs me greatly. It has been disturbing me for a long time, but I just like to tentatively suggest that, for example, the claim that the way in which the decolonization claim has been made may not be the optimally best kind of frame to put the grievance in. That is to say, it implies it leaves open the question is, what are you asking for? Are you asking for the return of Manhattan, for example, to the tribes that were conned into selling it? Because that kind of a return seems to me to be unrealistic and unlikely. I mean, likely to be honored with lip service and then ignored substantially by the powers that be. On the other hand, because, for example, I mean, this is an endemic problem throughout history. I mean, you find it in Israel, Palestine. You find it in the United States. Wherever one group of people moves onto another people's land, either they get along, and then sometimes they don't get along. Then there's a war, and there's a struggle for the land, and you can't really deny people the right to move. I mean, you can try, but unlikely to be successful. And as things stand now, the people who were colonized and who were cheated out of their land are treated as with less than equal rights, vastly less than equal rights. That's true in Palestine. That's true in much of the United States with the indigenous Native Americans. And if we were to clarify the grievances to distinguish our claims from wanting to get back all of our land to a more reasonable bargaining position, we might have more success.
I'm sorry, David. Can you please wrap up the question?
It's a suggestion, and I think I will just leave it at that. It isn't a question. It's a comment. I'm just trying to be helpful.
Would the speakers like to give their comments on the comment?
Sure, should I go ahead? I mean, I think what we need to do in terms of decolonization, and especially given the fear that's been going on, that, decolonizing a field would mean destroying it and sort of, out of existence, literally, that there will be no social sciences, that there will be no jobs that we can have going forward. I mean, these are all kinds of fears with respect to what's going on. In that context, I would like people at least to look at Bambra and Homewood's book, and I do have 10 books about that I found useful about social theory. I think with respect to what we need to do in this context, given the worries that are raised, these are worries that are raised by white people, white conservatives or white liberals even, and I want to sort of make a difference. What happened, a distinction. What happens is that, when we talk about these things, as David Schwartz is also doing, we're sort of we're at the stage of acknowledging the violence that's being done in our own past. That's the first stage. And that is where sort of white liberals, white neoliberals sort of stand. I think there is a second stage that you have to go to, and that is taking action. It's not enough to just talk about these things. Then you have to put these things into action. That is sort of what I call accountability. And that is where people are basically resisting, including white liberals. I mean, that's why I realized I'm a progressive. So that is, we have to sort of define where we're willing to go. The stage we're at is now we're all willing, at least in academia, to acknowledge the systemic violence in our own past. But then we don't want to do anything about it, or we haven't gone there yet. And that is, I think, where we need to focus in differentiating these two and actively seeking those who come up with solutions. And how are those solutions going to come? I think they will come not from how the whites are going to be reacting to anything, but what are the experiences of the people on the ground that have been persecuted for all these times. It has to be from the bottom up. So it has to start with stories, with understandings, with meanings, options we missed because of our obsession with formal knowledge and violence as a way of carrying things out. That's at least what I would add. Thank you.
I might, if I can just add on to that last comment in terms of I really appreciated how you kind of phased it out in terms of acknowledging what the problem is and then taking action, and kind of building off of my last comment about asking the discipline to be a little bit more porous, that we as an institution maybe also need to be a little bit more porous in terms of, yes, we're in the business of teaching and producing and circulating knowledge, right? But then there's this whole other world of people who are doing the work on the ground. And so how do we then, you know, I'm not going to pretend like I am in the front row, like being an activist, like that's not what I do day in and day out. But there are people who do that locally. And so how can we kind of bridge and like be more porous in terms of how we exchange information? And I'll give an example in that I'm the board of directors chair of a local nonprofit here. And I have learned so much from the staff who work in that nonprofit, who are dealing directly with issues of housing displacement, of youth, of just reworking and reorienting how nonprofit works. And it has been really incredible, to be perfectly honest. And I think that kind of like, at least we have to try to be a little bit more fluid in how we engage with other institutions outside of academia, because at some point, like the information just stops like actually communicating with each other. So I just wanted to say that, and I also see this note about peace from Veda in the comment, but maybe I'll take a pause there and see if James wants to comment as well.
Sure, excellent, thank you. The comments, you know, I kind of presented more of this, what is happening here from the structural element, and so the comments have flowed wonderfully for the two presentations after that lead into this thing, which would say, what would, you know, decolonization has been stated, we never really can decolonize because we're products of the colonization process. And so what would that look like? And especially in terms of, they were just showing a show here called The Making of Unmore. And so what would that look in terms of peace? And so a response to that is something that I learned recently. And so I know something of the Dakota language, not a lot, but I've been through a lot of the ceremonies. And so I went back, well, what is the actual word for peace in Dakota? And I've seen it used in the treaty conference among the Lakota. And so the most knowledgeable elder there said, well, we don't have a word for peace. We have a way of the people relating together in a healthy way. So we literally, the word we use for peace is wo Dakota, the name of ourselves interacting in a healthy way. And so that's kind of my response for both. What they're saying here is we have to begin to think, that's that sumak kose, you know, of the some of the people there in Ecuador and Bolivia. They're saying, what does a healthy life look like when we're treating each other in the world we're in with respect? And it'll likely lead to peace. So thank you for, I love the comments and where we've gone with this. So.
Actually, just to sort of go on this, I've learned so much from I'm with Native Americans because I had a Native American doctoral student, and it is exactly what, like, how do you define peace? In this context, how do you define health? Healthy sort of elders And it was very interesting because the surveys and existing things wanted to just look at sort of what kind of hospitals did they have, what kind of health facilities and services were there, only looking at the sort of hospital aspect of physical healing. And it turns out, of course, we used indigenous methodologies, and my Native American student went and talked to the Lakota in South Dakota. It turns out they define health not only by the body, they also bring in the mind and the spirit. Now, if that's the case, they never actually healed in the Western sense of the word when they go to a hospital. And they are also Native Americans, I think, are the only social group whose health declines when they go to urban centers, which is totally against modernity and its sort of conception of progress and civilization in urban areas, bourgeoisie, and things like that. So I think that also goes to even how we conceptualize health or well-being or peace is very much driven by this Western European modernity, the shadow it casts upon us. Thank you.
And I'll maybe just one last comment to add on to that. When I think about, I was actually, Veda's question here, I was actually thinking about when I was putting my thoughts together for this coffee hour, I was like, is the sociology of war and peace redundant? Like war and peace seem like peace in the way that in the US in terms of security discourses and of peace and the relationship between security and peace, right, seems to assume a necessity of war being a necessary evil to secure peace. And so I wonder, I guess if peace is not the I maybe I'll just take a pause there, and that, like, it was just like a tangential thought, and that I was like, is peace what is peace? It's like, what is time? Yeah, I'm not sure, like, how do we actually operationalize peace as sociologists? And it seems like peace always comes at the expense of somebody else. And it reminds me of this quote from Grace Lee Boggs when she said, "Can we live more simply so others can simply live?" And I think that this kind of assumption that peace is attainable and that it is a right that we have, that we should try to achieve, maybe sometimes comes at the expense, right? Whose expense does it come at? And in the systems and institutions and the way in which knowledge circulates in our current reality, it does feel like a little bit of a zero-sum game in that, like, it's going to come at the expense of somebody. And so who is that somebody?
I want to use and abuse my power as the moderator by also making a comment on the first comment about people move. That's true, people do move, but like, I think as knowledge producers, one act of decolonization, I agree with all the three speakers here that decolonization is a process, but one act of decolonization can be truth-telling about how and why some people had to move from one place to another, and how and why some other people move to other parts of the world to so where is the justice, where is the fairness, where is the inequality or equality in these processes of people moving? Can be a way of decolonization of sociology.
And I think in that context, that's why spatial analysis has become very significant, because how do you destabilize hegemony? You do it by taking concepts through time and space. And that immediately demonstrates how they are socially constructed. And, and then it also demonstrates how sort of Western conceptions are really monopolizing meaning, and how we're sort of now trying to go to the margins, to the borders, sort of what has been marginalized, and come from there, with an alternate knowledge production, as well as, deconstructing the hegemony in a way. And I think the most important thing going forward is we cannot do this as individuals. We have to do this as a community of scholars. That's why, I think we have to network, we have to support each other, because we cannot take on the whole system by ourselves. That's, of course, what capitalism and neoliberalism especially want us to do. But if the moment you do that, of course, it will be very easy for them to take us down one by one. But it will not be if we, are there together.
Yeah, thank you, Muge. If there are some more questions, please raise your hand. Okay, then I will ask a question. But please ask questions, whatever is in your mind, if it's critical, if it's pro-decolonization, anti-decolonization. One of the big purposes of this conversation was like to have a very open and honest conversation about these topics. So some of the speakers, one thing in my mind was like some of the speakers said that they do work on questions of war and peace, but they are not part of the section. And so I was wondering, how do you guys think we can make the section more inclusive and more hospitable place for scholars of decolonization, post-colonial theory, or who work on race and racism? I am sorry, we're out of time.
Oh,
I was
no.
gonna say, I'm so sorry, but I do need to go.
Yeah.
I took
I
the
did.
coffee hour very literally.
Yeah. I didn't realize, wow, the time has flown by.
Well,
I
this
just want
means
to
we
say
have
thank
to
you
have
so
more
much.
conversations like this one, obviously. This should be the first of many, hopefully, going forward. And thank you for organizing this. It demonstrates how much we need these things, especially how do we define war, peace, and conflict in the 21st century, where terrorism is sort of now the mode. I was thinking maybe you could change it to violence and just study violence in and of itself. That may be one way of doing it, sociology of violence, because then it will be more inclusive.
I don't know if we I get flags when I hear inclusivity because it becomes too big, and I would maybe put forth the kind of question of like, how can we make it more specific, actually narrow the project a little bit. There's a reason why subfields are subfields, right? And so what is it about the sociology of war and peace specific to it, that, what is the North Star? Like, what is driving this specific section? What orients the research and the teaching that folks do in this section? And so maybe that involves an audit of, who is involved in the section, what kind of scholarship is being put forth, circulated by the section as a first step, and then to see, right, like as James was saying, the silences, like who is not here, what kind of knowledge is not being circulated or produced through the section. And maybe that is like an entry point for us to think about, what is the project for the next, 20, 30 years? Because the sociology, like you were saying, like what does it mean in this current moment, right? To have our subfield be kind of tailored to the moments that we're in, and to have that built-in flexibility. Because colonialism is inherently flexible and changes as a shapeshifter, right? And constantly adapting. So I think that as a discipline that we too also need to be adapting as well.
So Shehrazad, do you want to take it from here?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us today, and especially our panelists. Thank you so much for your wonderful, excellent contributions. We have another coffee hour coming up on April 28th about the challenges of fieldwork in high-risk contexts. So if you're interested in that, please join us. Please consider joining us in the section as well. So yeah, thank you so much. Let's maybe give a round of applause for our speakers.
Thank you.
And I put the plug in the chat, but if any of you have research that you'd like to present at the virtual coffee hours, or are interested in organizing another panel, either to continue this conversation or on a different topic, please send an email to either myself or Shehrazad, and we will be happy to work with you to get this up and running. We want to make sure that our section has space for conversation year round, not just at the annual conference.
Thank you. See you.